In the late 1800s, new technology was emerging in America. There was a large number of natural resources and a big boom of businesses. Immigrants were traveling to the United States in hope of a better life. More importantly, the Transcontinental Railroad was built on May 10, 1869. In 1850, the Bessemer process was developed by a British manufacturer named Henry Bessemer and by an American ironmaker named William Kelly. By 1880, the new process was used to produce more than 90% of the nation's steel. The railroads required a huge amount of steel because there were thousands of miles of track. Railroads greatly impacted Americans because people and goods were capable of being transported from one place to another. This helped big businesses grow because they were receiving resources from different parts of the country. However, railroads would not exist today if it were not for the Chinese immigrants. Many Chinese immigrants first arrived in the United States during the California Gold Rush to seek fortunes. When they settled in America, they played a huge role in building the nation's railroads with the knowledge and skills that they brought from China. Thus, the work ethics and techniques of Chinese immigrants were essential to building the Transcontinental Railroad, and it paved the way for American businesses to grow during the Gilded Age. Chinese immigrants left their homeland due to harsh conditions like poverty, after they were defeated by the British in the Opium War in the 1840s. They also left due to the social unrest that made up their homeland. In the 1850s, more than 40,000 Chinese immigrants arrived in California in hopes of gaining riches from the gold rush. In the newly made raceway of the Sawmill, recently erected by Captain Sutter on the American Fork, gold has been found in considerable quantities. One person brought $30 worth to New Helvetia, gathered there in a short time. California, no doubt, is rich in mineral wealth. Great changes here for scientific capitalists. Gold has been found in almost every part of the country. Even though they stopped searching for gold, many Chinese immigrants stayed in California to look for other jobs. Some of them worked in silver mines, and others were cooks or domestic servants in cities. Eventually, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad began. At first, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific did not want to hire the Chinese due to the prejudice that was happening. In the midst of the 1860s, the leaders of the Central Pacific realized that it was difficult to find railroad workers. The company decided to hire Chinese laborers because the railroad began in Sacramento, California, which is where there was a huge population of Chinese immigrants. They were also willing to lay tracks in dangerous places at a low cost.
In 1865, Chinese immigrants were first hired to work on the railroad and were only paid $28 per month. Their agents, who were Chinese and American merchants, provided the Chinese their supplies of food and also determined how to divide the wages among the Chinese.
The Chinese had to live in simple dwellings while cooking their own meals, such as fish. Moreover, they had to do very dangerous work on the terrain of the high Sierra Mountains. Chinese workers worked from sunrise to sunset for 6 days a week. Most Chinese did not work for the whole time of construction, so others would replace them. This is due to the fact that the work was very tiresome and they were rarely given rest. Our foreman then ordered us to pack up and return to Yale. So, although already suffering pangs of hunger, we had to start on our way immediately. Through horrible weathers, the Chinese continued to work. They worked through 2 of the worst winters that have ever been recorded, including the last few years of the Little Ice Age. Some snowslides would even sweep away the camps of the Chinese. Knowing this, they risked their lives and continued to work. When we were passing China Bar on the way, many of the Chinese died from an epidemic. As there were no coffins to bury the dead, the bodies were stuffed into rock crevices or earth the trees to await their arrival. This made the Chinese the perfect workers because they learned fast and quickly performed their skills. Chinese railroad workers had a variety of work techniques while working on the railroad. Most of the railroad work was done at high elevations in the mountains, making it far more dangerous. It became apparent early in the season that the amount of labor likely to be required during the summer could only be supplied by the employment of the Chinese element of our population. In the summer of 1865, Chinese began construction on Cape Horn. It was a 3-mile roadbed carrying along the mountain at a high elevation. During the construction, Chinese workers were lowered by ropes from the tops of cliffs into baskets, and while suspended, they planted explosives at chipped granite and used it to blast tunnels. This was one of the many dangerous ways in which they worked. Chinese bodies flew from the cave as if shot from a cannon. Blood and flesh were mixed in a horrible mess. On this occasion, about 10 or 20 workers were killed. Furthermore, the Chinese drilled holes into the Sierra Nevada mountains and packed black powder or nitroglycerin to blast through the rocks. The Chinese carried away the dirt and rubble in baskets and horse-drawn dump carts. The cars now run nearly to the summit of the Sierras. 4,000 laborers were at work, 1/10 Irish, the rest Chinese. They were a great army laying siege to nature in her strongest citadel. The rugged mountains looked like stupendous anthills. Overall, the Chinese railroad was made mostly by hand using pickaxes, hammers, and crowbars, but without the Chinese and their techniques, the entire process will have lasted much longer. In the fall of 1865, Chinese proved that their work ethics were one of a kind. Wherever we put them, we found them good, and they worked themselves into our favor to such an extent that if we found we were in a hurry for a job of work, it was better to put Chinese on at once. At first, work was slow and difficult. Once they reached 23 miles of making railway tracks, the Chinese had to face an even more difficult task in the Central Pacific, where laying tracks over terrain rose 7,000 feet in 100 miles. A large part of our force are Chinese, and they prove nearly equal to white men in the amount of labor they perform and are far more reliable. No danger of strikes among them. The Chinese were consistently working on creating railroad tracks, aqueducts, and tunnels. They built 15 tunnels that went through solid granite. Additionally, Chinese laborers had to clear trees, stumps, rocks, and other obstacles in the way. On April 28, 1869, Chinese laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in one day. They worked between 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. with a midday break. This teamwork was such an accomplishment that no one has ever been able to repeat such a feat. A perfect reminder of how important the Chinese were to the Transcontinental Railroad. Chinese are faithful and industrious, and under proper supervision, some become skillful in the performance of their duty. Many of them are becoming very expert in drilling, blasting, and other departments of rock work. With the help of Chinese immigrants, the introduction of the Transcontinental Railroad led people to resettle from rural areas into the cities where there were more job opportunities, such as textile and manufacturing industries. The Transcontinental Railroad has influenced the way people are able to travel from one place to another, increasing populations in certain areas that are situated near railroads. Due to the huge amount of long-distance travelers, railroads have changed into a more comfortable transportation for passengers. They provide a place to sleep while passengers are traveling to their next destination. Additionally, the striving success of the Chinese lured railroads into isolated cities, towns, and settlements, which have a direct growth of trade within those areas. Some towns have become well known for their products as well. Railroads have allowed goods like agricultural products and livestock to be transported to different places across the country. Due to the achievement of the Chinese, companies have gained more businesses because their products are able to be spread and purchased from customers in different areas. Thus, railroads have a huge impact on the economy and population in America today due to an important role that the Chinese workers played during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Today, in 2018, California is in the middle of production in its very own speedy bullet train, similarly to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad by the Chinese immigrants. After voters approved a ballot proposition in 2008, the state's high-speed rail authority began the construction of its idealistic railroad in 2015. The high-speed rail project is planning to build about 800 miles of track all over California. The train's cruising speed of 220 miles per hour will grant access to Californians for a fast and convenient way to travel. However, Californians are having difficulties in building the railroad because the train's cost has increased from $40 billion to $64 billion in 2016. This construction is progressing at a slow rate due to the project running over budget and behind schedule. Similarly, Chinese immigrants faced many hardships in building the Transcontinental Railroad. Instead of having financial struggles, they had horrible working conditions. While having to use heavy materials to build the Transcontinental Railroad, they had to accomplish building many miles of track in one day, all of which highlights the importance of the Chinese contribution to the railroad and why such a build would not be possible without them.